Hi, my name is Brian Forbes, and this is my Module 3 presentation for special education uh, for emerging leaders. These are the interviews I conducted for three different staff members in my building. The first of which is my building principal, Melissa Hanson. The second of which is the special education instructor, Kristen Hoffman. And the third person I interviewed was a paraprofessional by the name of Barb Draper. And I reference all three of those individuals again at the very end of my presentation. So the first question, we started off with, we discussed with all three individuals, was about our child find procedures. Those are basically, how do we identify students in special education or in need of attention from the special education department? So starting from left to right, let's start discussing the administrator first. When I spoke to Mrs. Hanson, she had shared with me that basically, as far as she is concerned, typically parents have requests for testing to see if their children qualify for particular accommodations. And a lot of times this stems from families that she said that their children have gone to doctors and their doctors have diagnose them with ADHD and then prescribe them with medicine, and so then they want to have their children put on the special education or in the special education program so that they can then receive additional accommodations for those types of things. Now, in addition to parent requests, we also have sit teams within our building, and Mrs. Hanson brought that up during our interview time as well, about how teachers notice things in the classroom and they bring that to the attention of counselors or administrators, and then which we then take to the special education department, and then we start trying to monitor to gather a lot more information and data to see if there are things that we think that are identifiable. In that case, we begin the testing process as well, but always with parents' contact and agreement on their end as well, consent to go forward in those areas. Now, the instructor, Mrs. Hoffman, shared with me basically kind of the same thing. She said, in the middle school level, we don't have that many parents who ask for their students to be identified or attempt to be identified as something. Most of that happens at the elementary school level. So she did mention that while it's kind of rare, most of the time it does happen on, in the earlier stages. But she said if it has to happen, she said that in addition to the parent request and the sit meetings, the sit teams that get together to do that, like I said, the core instructors and administrators, counselors, those types of things, a lot of times that information, whether it's a request or a sit team identification, those things are pushed to our district special education coordinator. And she said usually the coordinator for our district comes in and takes that over and sets up the meetings between the parents and the admin team and the students' team of instructors to see, is this something that everybody agrees needs to happen? It's not always just based on what a doctor might have said or whatever. So we look at individual data. They may have a medical diagnosis for a condition, but at the same time, if we don't find on our end that the student is lacking an ability because of underserved needs, then a lot of times, we don't push forward on that. But so some of the things that we do, pointed out from Mrs. Hoffman was Ames Web is something that is undergone as a testing, ability, I guess, of the district in order to use to try and find that information. Each individual teacher fills out questionnaires where they rank the student in different areas, from attention to completion of work, behavior, those types of things, and to make some findings as well. And then we also compare our test data. I think is one of the bigger things to see, are students achieving at a certain level compared to their peers. And then the peers that have the conditions that parents or doctors or the team thinks that student might have. And then there's a lot of, information that goes into that the district coordinator then uses to make a determination on whether or not they want to move forward. Now, our paraprofessional, Mrs. Draper, wonderful woman. I've worked with her for many years, actually. She's been in and out of my classroom before. During different years. I don't have her this year, unfortunately. She's by far my favorite para. She's just so kind, to the kids and to me for that matter. But that's a whole other story. So anyway, talking about our child find procedures, Ms. Draper, she kind of reiterated what Ms. Hoffman had said, as far as most of the time we don't really deal with a lot of that. Anyway, as far as her end goes, she said that once she's with a kid, she can make recommendations, or she can identify something that she passes along to the special education instructor. But besides that, she really doesn't play much of a role until the child's already been identified. Now, it was really interesting when we got to these questions about, what are the most challenging and rewarding aspects of their everyday working with special education children and families. And so as we move into these next couple of questions, you're going to see a lot of the times these people parallel each other, and they really kind of build off of one another from top down or bottom up. You'll notice kind of a trend. So anyway, when I spoke to Mrs. Hanson, my administrator, about this, she really talked about that she struggles personally with things not always being black and white in the world of special education. She said that she likes things to have clear-cut answers and rules to go by, and if this happens, then we need to do this. And she said that's really been the toughest part for her as an administrator, not having that much experience in special education, moving into her role as a building principal, is just having to be open to continue to try new things, because sometimes it's not the first or the fifth or the 10th or the 20th thing that works for a kid, but you just got to keep hammering it out to figure out what's going to work best. And so she said that's really been kind of her own personal obstacle that she's had to overcome and just kind of come to terms with in dealing with special education students. The instructor, Mrs. Hoffman, she talked about just simply, having to have the time as a special education instructor to figure out what every student needs, because unlike the core curriculum instructors, where we sit down and we say, okay, we're dealing with 120 kids, 150 kids every day, how do we best serve these groups of kids in order to get them from where we think they are to where we want them to be based on state standards. And it's not to say that, Mrs. Hoffman led to believe that the standards and things aren't important, or they don't matter, or they don't play into her lesson planning for kids. But she said, she has a smaller group of kids that she's focusing on. And instead of thinking of one group of, instruction, she has to focus on individual instruction for kids. And she talked about how, that just takes up so much time. And that time, most of it is usually spent outside of her workday or outside of the classroom, because during the school day, throughout the school year even, they don't have the time that most other, on-level instructors have to get together and meet as teams or, curriculum partners. And so that's a huge challenge for her. The paraprofessional, Ms. Draper, really kind of mirrored the same thing in that regard. She talked about how, they just don't have time to do what they need to do. A little bit differently, they're not necessarily coming up with the curriculum that you would see from the core instructor or the special education teacher, but instead they're filling out paperwork, they're filling in notes, they're making copies, they're rewriting things for children, they're setting up emails. They're just doing an immense amount of work, but they don't have any off periods at all. So they have it even worse in that regard than just the regular special education instructor, who maybe has one, and the regular teacher who has two, at least in our building. And so paraprofessionals have zero time off, so they have to come in early or stay late so that they can fill out all of this paperwork that has to go with each child. Now, something else we're going to see here, and I'm noticing it's cutting it off a little bit, but basically what is the most rewarding part of working with special needs kids is, again, let's work left to right here, when the principal, talked about just seeing that all of those problems. So when she's had to learn to overcome the aspect of not being able to have like cookie cutter fixes sometimes, however, she sees it like a puzzle. She talks about how stressful it can be, but then how rewarding, even more so than the cookie cutter fixes, that, it just fills her with a sense of, pride and accomplishment whenever she really finds something that works for these kids. that have issues that aren't traditional. Now, the special education instructor, said something kind of similar. She talks about, how much Mrs. Hoffman is rewarded by kids who, maybe the light bulb comes on and they get something for the very first time, especially when they have to struggle with it. And it takes so much longer sometimes than, their peers and counterparts. And so that was what, she really found most rewarding. And then our paraprofessional, Mrs. Draper, she talked about kind of the same thing, except she really emphasized more on building these positive relationships with kids. Yeah, she wants them to succeed, but she wants to see them kind of grow in all areas because she spends so much more time with these kids than the rest of us. We're always looking at their academic achievements, but she's looking at them as people, as growing emotionally as much as academically. And so that was a really big thing for her. Now, something else that we discussed in our interviews was, what advice would they have for the supervision of special education staff? And so, my current administrator, Mrs. Hanson, really said the thing that's helped her out the most is making sure that she always keeps on her appraisal list special education instructors and paraprofessionals when that is the case, so that she's not always just going into the regular ed classrooms and seeing how those things are done. She's taking the time to make sure that she gets into those special education rooms, which sometimes it would be easy to overlook if she didn't keep those teachers on her appraisal list. So she said that has really helped her gain a better understanding of the department, what those teachers do, and how they're dealing with all of their kids at the severe levels up to the minor levels as well. Now, Mrs. Hoffman, the instructor, special education instructor, she discussed that what she really thought was trying to match up, what she calls personalities, but really what I think she means is, she wants the on-level the on-level teachers and the special education instructors to get along with one another, because when they have positive relationships with one another, so much more happens that's impactful for the students that they share. And the paraprofessional, she really just focused more on, she wants people, especially an administrator, to be supportive of the special education department, not bog them down with unnecessary tasks or paperwork, or additional things that maybe would slow their day down even more when they already have enough to do. So how do they all work effectively with parents? Basically, the administrator talks about, she's just there to be an ear for parents. She wants them to make sure that they feel like they're heard, that they all have a voice, especially in, the education of their children. And then usually when that occurs, families are usually happy and don't cause a lot of problems. And she said she's, been very lucky in that regard. And it's true that not all, places are like that. We don't always have cordial families, and up to this point, she just seems very lucky. Our special education instructor talked again about communication with parents. That you can't over communicate. You want to send emails as much as possible. You want to talk about, how the student did on a daily or a weekly basis, update them on everything that's not always even just academic, but behavior as well, emotional, little gross things that, sometimes us core teachers sometimes think is elementary, but really goes a long way with special education and their families. The paraprofessional, again, kind of reiterated a little bit about communication, but she was more about communication with teachers, whether the special education instructor or the core classroom. And then if she ever wants to relay information to a parent, I think just the way our district is designed, she's not really allowed to do that. So she has to, kind of go through the special education instructor in order to make that happen. So, it's not necessarily that she's barred or prohibited. I'm not sure exactly, why that is, but it's, I think it's just proper protocol in her case to make sure that anything she feels is kind of ran through the special education instructor, and then that instructor makes the call about, if it's something worthy to discuss with the parent at home, or if there's some other, avenue or road that needs to be taken in that